About to witness the strength of street knowledge. Witness the strength. Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Terrorize the jam like troops in Pakistan.
Street knowledge. Street knowledge. Quick service announcement brought to you in part by Warriors.
Damn, that shit was dope.
Welcome back. It's another live stream of Warrior Creed with me, the radical Maajid Nawaz, and my brother, as always, the infamous Usman Raja. And today we're bringing to you a live stream on the topic of how Likudniks, in other words, Netanyahu-Wing Zionists this week, have been openly rejecting the notion of a Palestinian state. The UK Israeli ambassador to London was the first to do so. Then their former ambassador to London, the one before this one, Mark Regev, who's now a senior advisor to Netanyahu, whom I know actually, Regev. I met with him a few times while he was in London as an ambassador to provide, of course, my political commentary and views on the Middle East. He has also come out publicly now and rejected the notion of a Palestinian state. So the image for today's show, as you can see there, we have done so deliberately because those, like Hamas, by the way, who have been calling for a one-state solution, that is now the official policy of those running the Israeli government. And therefore, what they're aspiring to, in fact, makes them no difference to what they despise in the ultimate conclusion to their political aspirations, and that's a one-state solution. So what we're going to do today is establish that through the course of the clips that we're going to show you from these two voices, the two ambassadors to London from Israel, their views now rejecting the idea of a Palestinian state, the consequences of those views, both for Israel in the medium to long term, and also for the region and therefore the world, because this is quite a significant open shift. They have used this crisis as an opportunity to declare their hand. Of course, those who have been following this issue for a long time will be aware that that has been the precise accusation coming from the Palestinian negotiators for a long time, that Likud do not want a two-state solution. Now it's out in the open. In turn, Likud have responded by saying they cannot find a partner for peace on the other side, in other words, on the Palestinian side, and have been pointing to none other than Hamas. But as we on Warrior Creed have been demonstrating, that's the dialectic. It suits Netanyahu-Wing Zionists to point to Hamas and say, we've got no partner for peace on the other side. That's why, for such a long time on Warrior Creed, over multiple shows, we've been keen to demonstrate by showing receipts that Netanyahu-Wing Zionists, the Likudniks, the Likud party that is currently the governing party in Israel, they have for a long time, with Netanyahu at their head, been facilitating the rise of Hamas right up until and including October the 7th. They facilitated, Netanyahu specifically facilitated these events so that he could precisely have that precise pretext of saying, we've got no partner for peace on the other side. Look at what Hamas just did, and therefore support us in expanding our occupation from not just the West Bank, but to include all of Gaza and perhaps even chunks of South Lebanon now, that we're looking at, North Lebanon now, South Israel, and instead say, sorry, the other way around, getting my North and South mixed up. But point being some chunks of Lebanon as well, and say we need to expand the Israeli state because that's the only pragmatic solution to this crisis. That's the line Likud have now been openly declaring, and we're going to, of course, demonstrate this through the clips that they've come out into the media this week, and those media clips to show you precisely where they are, the Likud party, the governing party of Israel, vis-a-vis a two-state solution. Keep in mind, as I say, that the receipts for all of how we've demonstrated that Netanyahu-led Likud facilitated up to and including October the 7th those attacks, That's all demonstrated for you in the previous live streams on Warrior Creed. You can go back and find the archives on Radical Media, which is found majidnawaz.substack.com. For those of you listening on the podcast, the previous Warrior Creed podcasts are all available there, and as are, of course, the written version of these conversations with the receipts hyperlinked. Everything is linked up. You can go and find it for yourself, including how the CCTV footage of precisely what happened on October the 7th went missing. If you remember, we declared it was Epstein, the CCTV footage, which would have demonstrated, of course, how the Israeli helicopters were shooting into the Nova Music Festival at their own civilians, which, of course, it throws huge doubts into the Netanyahu narrative as to exactly what happened on that day, as does the absence of the 40 beheaded babies. The CCTV footage would have shed some light on what exactly happened that day. Of course, that went missing. We've demonstrated that the Netanyahu-Wing Zionists knew from over a year ago that they had warnings, specific warnings of these attacks that they chose not to heed. We've demonstrated how the Egyptians also warned the Israelis that these attacks were coming. Netanyahu chose not to heed that. We've demonstrated how even former serving members of the IDF on the very next day or so after these October the 7th attacks came out as whistleblowers, demonstrating that they found it impossible and highly improbable that the response time by the IDF to those attacks would have been 7 hours. And that indicates that the IDF were given a stand-down order because, of course, that border, that Gaza border fence is one of the most securitized regions on the entire planet. How it took 7 hours for them to respond is something that remains, again, unanswered. The CCTV footage would have shed light on all of that. It was Epstein, as we revealed in previous episodes of this very show, with all the receipts. So with all that in mind, when you hear those that are in the Netanyahu-Wing Zionist camp stating that there is no partner for peace, and that's why they need a one-state solution, keep in mind that we're alleging with, of course, receipts, not just an allegation. This is substantiated with evidence. We're alleging that that's what they wanted all along. They wanted to destroy the partner for peace on the other side. Hence, they facilitated Hamas. They wanted to destroy, which partner was that? The Fatah-led Palestinian administration. They wanted to destroy any notion of the reasonable voice on the Palestinian side, so that, as Piers Morgan is doing through his own pandering to that dialectic on his show, to demonstrate a choice to the Western world, it's either civilized people who speak English in your own accent and have your skin complexion, a choice between them, regardless of how many bombs they drop on Gaza, or the medievalists on the other side who want to behead babies. That's the dialectic they want to prop up, so that the Western populations are forced into a corner when it comes to supporting Netanyahu's further occupation of not just the West Bank, but including all of Gaza, and his provocation, his desire to provoke a wider regional war. Because as we said in this very live stream, by their deeds you should know them. After these 4 days of pause expire, war hawks will not be able to hide. They need war to continue. Their very survival depends on it. By their actions you should judge them, and by their deeds you shall know them. So all of those who had the opportunity for peace and yet continued to harp for war have shown their hands. And the people who want peace have been consistent in condemning any escalation, whichever side it comes from, for the purposes of achieving peace. So these are the times in which we can identify those who have war as an interest. Have a look at this. This is the current serving Israeli ambassador to London, Zipi Hotevli, I hope I pronounced the surname correctly, stating very clearly their lack of a desire for a two-state solution.
Two-state solution? Is there still a chance for a two-state solution?
I think it's about time for the world to realize the Oslo paradigm failed on the 7th of October, and we need to build a new one. And in order to build a new one...
Does that new one include the Palestinians living in a state of their own? Is that what it includes?
I think the biggest question is, what type of Palestinians are on the other side? This is what Israel realized on the 7th of October. The answer is absolutely no, and I'll tell you why.
Well, then
because
how can there be peace? How can there be peace in
the reason there is no peace
Israel?
is because the Palestinians...
Without offering a state to Palestine, how can there be peace in Israel?
Israel knows today, and the world should know now, the reason the Oslo Accords failed is because the Palestinians never wanted to have a state next to Israel. They want to have a state from the river to the sea.
So the two-state solution is dead.
Why are you obsessed with a formula that never worked, that created these radical people in the other side? Why are you obsessed with that?
So you heard the catchphrases we identified for you before going into that clip. The idea there wasn't a partner for peace on the other side, that partner never existed. It's as if, of course, the Oslo Accords hadn't happened. And then the current Israeli ambassador to London stated that the Palestinian idea was from the river to the sea, and therefore that is proof that they never wanted a two-state solution. So what we're going to demonstrate to you now is, of course, that precise phrase, from the river to the sea, is a phrase that Zipi Hotovli herself and the Likud party have been officially not only adopting but propagating for many years, way before October the 7th. This is an article in the Middle East Eye, and the headline there you can see is Israel-Palestine War, the long-standing anti-Palestine views of Israel's envoy to the UK. The Israeli ambassador, says the subheading, has long campaigned against the Palestinian state. The 7th of October Hamas assault isn't the turning point she claims it is. So as you could probably work out, this article was written after that clip we just shown you. It's a commentary on that clip. And as always, we give credit where credit is due and criticize where criticism is due. So don't worry about whether you read the Middle East Eye or not. The point is what we're about to reveal to you true or not? That's the point. Is it verifiable? So have a look at what's in the article. We're going to read an extract. The Israeli ambassador, however, has long held views denying the possibility of a Palestinian state, and even wrote a policy paper on the steps Israel should take to prevent one. Now, Amod, a UK-based Jewish organization that opposes the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land, has translated Zipi Hotovli's essay called The Five-Stage Plan for the Greater Land of Israel. It's linked there in the extract. Again, we'll be putting all these receipts in Radical Media, maajidnawaz.substack.com, the written version of this live stream and podcast. You can check all of this for yourselves. We want you to check it for yourselves. We don't want you just to believe anyone when they tell you something. Continues there in the article, the five-stage plan for the Greater Land of Israel, written in 2013 when she was a member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. In the essay, Hotovli writes, the long years of propaganda for the vision of two states for two peoples have obstructed the most basic desire harbored by a majority of Israeli citizens not to give up territory that was conquered through blood. So that's the current Israeli ambassador to London in 2013 writing that the majority of Israeli citizens do not wish to give up to any territory that was conquered through blood. But the article continues. Of course, there you can see that's a clear rejection in 2013, not 7th of October 2023. An entire decade ago, the current Israeli ambassador to London, Zipi Hotovli, has stated very clearly ideas that would imply or render the notion of a two-state solution to have finished over a decade ago. The article continues. She was then the youngest Likud Knesset member, the article states, argued that a binational danger is preferable to a Palestinian state. Quote, she said, this is from her, in the binational process, we have a degree of control. But the moment you abandon the area to the Palestinian entity, what control do you have over what will happen there? She said. I want it to be clear that I do not recognize the national rights of Palestinians in the land of Israel. I recognize their human rights and their individual rights, and also their individual political rights. But between the sea and Jordan, there is room for one state, a Jewish state. There couldn't really be a clearer statement than that from 10 years ago by the current UK ambassador to Israel, rejecting the idea of a Palestinian state. But in such words and such terms, from the river to the sea, as you heard there yourselves in her own words, that when repeated today by the Palestinian pro-Palestine protesters, is alleged is a chant in support of terrorism. And the receipts or evidence shown to substantiate that allegation is simply because the Hamas charter doesn't recognize Israel. So we would grant it to you that if Ismail Haniyeh was chanting from the river to the sea, he probably means the end of Israel when saying it. But a pro-Palestine student on the streets of London raising nothing but a Palestinian flag, such as this one on the screen, saying from the river to the sea, isn't advocating for Hamas's charter. But of course, as we now know, as Netanyahu has confessed to, that dialectic, that any pro-Palestinian sentiment, no matter how un-Islamist, to use the phrase, is simply a pro-Hamas sentiment. That very dialectic is precisely what Netanyahu-Wing Zionists want everybody to adopt. Again, that there's either a choice between civilized people that speak in your own accent, have a skin complexion similar to yours, or medieval Islamists on the other side. That's the very dialectic they want to present. But that's why we're suggesting context for me and not for thee is not the way forward. If Zipi Hotovely, the current UK ambassador, Israeli ambassador to the UK, if her statement from the river to the sea can be contextualized as not implying the genocide of Palestinians, then how is it that those students and others protesting on the pro-Palestine protests across the world, when they say from the river to the sea, how is it that that must mean genocide of Jews? We'll show you again the official Likud party policy from their own charter, with the heading, "The right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel," stating there in the green that we've highlighted for everybody, in their original 1977 policy position, quote, "Between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty." If that's not a genocidal and terrorist chant coming from those who are currently engaged in what we believe and what Biden recently even advised the Israeli government about, is the indiscriminate bombing of civilians, 50% of whom are children in Gaza. If that's not genocidal, then of course, how on earth is it genocidal for pro-Palestine protesters to be raising the very same chant from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free? In fact, we would suggest that's where the chant originated. So think about that for a moment, but this isn't really about the chant, yeah? We don't want to get distracted too much by wordings. That's actually, the semantics of this all are part of the distraction designed to lock you into the dialectic so you continue fighting. The point here is that if it is now, as we're demonstrating to you that it is, the official policy of the Likudniks in charge of the Israeli government, of the current Israeli administration, that they reject the two-state solution, that changes a lot. Have a listen to the ambassador before this one, the one with whom I met many times, Mark Regev, in my work capacity, formal official meetings about the counterterrorism issues we were engaged in. This is Mark Regev adopting the same policy as Zipi Hotovely, and indeed adopting the policy now that we're stating is the Netanyahu-Wing Likudnik policy, and they're running the Israeli government. That's the way this war is therefore going to go. Here's Mark Regev.
Should the Palestinians, if they have a state, should they be able to sign, let's say, a military agreement, a military treaty with Iran? Should they be able to have an army, an air force? Should they have all those military powers that could theoretically threaten the state of Israel? And the answer, in our view, is clearly no.
Why should they be prohibited from having, my question would be, why should they be prohibited from having exactly the same rights as a state to Israel? Wouldn't that be ultimately the way you actually achieve peace? Not allowing the Palestinians to have the same rights as Israelis has just not worked, has it? I mean, demonstrably not worked.
On the contrary, if this is going to work, it has to be based on realism. We can't base peace.
Islam, my friends, is in
peers. Should the Palestinians, if they have a state, should they be able to sign, let's say, a military agreement, a military treaty with Iran? Should they be able to have an army, an air force? Should they have all those military powers that could theoretically threaten the state of Israel? And the answer, in our view, is clearly no.
Why should they be prohibited from having, my question would be, why should they be prohibited from having exactly the same rights as a state to Israel? Wouldn't that be ultimately the way you actually achieve peace? Not allowing the Palestinians to have the same rights as Israelis has just not worked, has it? I mean, demonstrably not worked.
On the contrary, if this is going to work, it has to be based on realism. We can't base peace on assumptions that just aren't founded on reality. And Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, who wanted to make peace with the Palestinians, who was the Prime Minister at the time of the signing of the Oslo Accords, he gave a speech, and he was very clear. He said that the Palestinians will have less than a state. Yitzhak Rabin said, the man who was shot for his efforts to move forward on the peace process. He said that the future Palestinian areas will have to be demilitarized. He said the Jordan Valley, that area on the eastern edge of the Palestinian territories, would have to remain under Israeli control. The idea that a Palestinian area will have to be demilitarized in any future settlement, that's common sense.
Apologies for the interruption in that clip. We accidentally played a clip that's coming up soon. But the point there you should have got very clearly from Mark Regev. The idea of a two-state solution is now being openly rejected. Mark Regev in that clip pointed to Iran as a threat, which has been the Netanyahu-Wing Zionist policy for a while, to try and provoke war, a regional war with Iran. We put it to you that the civil war in Yemen between MBS's Saudi regime and the Houthis backed by Iran was an extension of the civil war being provoked in the region, as was the conflict in Syria, which again, with the rise of ISIS being facilitated by certain interests in Netanyahu-Wing operatives with Mossad and the CIA. Again, we've demonstrated that it is something that if you look to a lot of the leaked cables and a lot of the information coming from that conflict, it was within the foreign policy aims of Netanyahu-Wing Zionists to facilitate the rise of ISIS in Syria, to undermine Assad, who was allied to Putin. All of that has come out. And so the idea of pointing to Iran to provoke a regional war, that's established, as was the notion that the Netanyahu-Wing Zionists were never really accepting of a two-state solution. But that's now being said out in the open, using the rationale that would you ever have allowed Palestinians to have an armed forces? Well, the very definition of a state, the actual very definition of a state in political theory, in Western political theory, is having a monopoly of violence. That is literally what Max Weber defines the state as, which, and by the way, is not even up for really disputed. Whether you agree or disagree with it, having a monopoly on violence is what a state has. So you can't, on the one hand, pay lip service to a Palestinian state while denying that state to have a monopoly on violence within its territory. Then it's not a state. And as you just heard there, coming from Mark Regev, senior advisor to Netanyahu, the argument is now being made that even the Oslo Accords with Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated by an Israeli Jewish extremist for having the audacity to sign a peace accord with the Oslo Accords with Yasser Arafat, and he was killed for his troubles, as was, of course, Sadat when he tried it in 1981 in Egypt. But you heard from Mark Regev stating that even Yitzhak Rabin didn't intend a state. Well, then that's a confession that there's never been a partner for peace on the Israeli side. Is that what Mark Regev is stating? And what we're attempting to maintain as a position is that Netanyahu and Netanyahu-Wing Likudniks inside the Israeli government, current and historically, have never really wanted a partner for peace. They've wanted the dialectic of conflict to continue to grow so that they can point to the other side and say, they're a bunch of medieval terrorists. There isn't a partner for peace. It's why war is the only solution. And everything we're witnessing right now is demonstrating that. It's being played out. Netanyahu is attempting to convince everybody that war is the only solution, which is why he's carrying on with precisely that, with war. And again, as we stated, by their deeds you shall know them. The pause did indeed expire. And we said war hawks will not be able to hide. They need war to continue. Their very survival depends on it. By their actions, you should judge them, and by their deeds, you should know them. Now, here is an example of, again, what we're stating very clearly from December the 16th, the Spectator Index even stated, breaking, Netanyahu says to a reporter, you and your journalist friends have been blaming me for almost 30 years for putting the brakes on the Oslo Accords and preventing the Palestinian state. That is true. That's an actual quote by Netanyahu that the Spectator, this isn't some alternative website, right? That's the UK Spectator, one of the most preeminent right-wing political magazines in this country, quoting Netanyahu, stating that for 30 years, he's been opposing the idea of a Palestinian state, and that's why he's scuppered on the Oslo Accords. So how the current Israeli ambassador to London can argue that the reason there cannot be a two-state solution and therefore a Palestinian state is because there's no partner for peace on the Palestinian side, when we've just demonstrated with receipts in a way that, I don't like to be so definitive, but it's just irrefutably, right, that's their policy has been never to recognize a Palestinian state. In fact, from the river to the sea, they've only wanted an Israeli state, and they've done everything they can to undermine the notion of a Palestinian state. That's what we believe. We've just demonstrated that in a way that is difficult to argue against. And yet, mainstream opinion is woefully unaware of all of that. And I'd say actually beyond mainstream opinion, a lot of the commentators in your feeds are lapping up the propaganda that there is no partner for peace on the other side because there's only Hamas, and that from the river to the sea, when chanted by pro-Palestine protesters, is a chant for genocide. And again, see, that's why there's no partner for peace, because they're a bunch of genocidal maniacs. That's what they want you to believe, because they don't want a partner for peace. And it is unbelievable that people are falling yet again for the propaganda. The same people that after COVID thought they'd woken up and yet cheered on for war in Ukraine. Notice this, it's the same people. Then they realized, oh yes, actually Zelensky's a bit of a burden. Now they're cheering for war in Gaza. They are the same warmongers. What they are doing is deploying voices one by one until those voices no longer serve a purpose. Then, of course, they cut them loose, but they have new voices to deploy. And every time they're deploying voices to convince you to continue to support war, but really it's to continue to support the pharma military industrial complex for profit. Just look at the scandals being revealed as we speak in even today's Times newspaper about Michelle Mone selling fake personal protective equipment, PPE, to government ministers by calling them all up because they were her mates and getting millions. And that's now subject to a civil and criminal investigation. We know that the same administration in the UK was selling equipment, PPE, via pub landlords who had no expertise in import-export PPE business. And yet that's what they did during COVID. Look to Ukraine and how they attempted again to launder money through the war in Ukraine to support their chosen political candidates in the United States of America, the FTX scandal with Sam Bankman-Fried. This isn't stuff we're making up. They literally use emergencies to launder money. We've just given an example with COVID and with the war in Ukraine. How much money do you think is being laundered now for war in Gaza? So we're asking people to remain vigilant. This idea that there's no partner for peace on the Palestinian side is propaganda. But of course, there are militia on the other side. Those militia, such as Hamas, we have on the record Likudniks, such as their leader Netanyahu, saying that we need to facilitate them so that we can ruin the idea of a Palestinian state. Go back to all the previous Radical Media episodes, Warrior Creed episodes on this topic of Gaza specifically, if you need to revise any of those receipts. So that's why when George Galloway recently went on the Morgan show to respond to Morgan's almost robotic and by now laughable attempts to constantly ask simply one question to his audience: do you condemn Hamas? Instead of taking a more neutral and holistic perspective on this subject, George Galloway's response, we believe, should be humbling for those who are unable to zoom out and see that this entire conflict has multiple perspectives and not just one morally superior approach to it. Have a look at George Galloway's response to Piers Morgan when asked about terrorism.
Terrorism? You want to talk to me, Piers? about terrorism. The people running Israel today invented modern terrorism. They tried to murder Winston Churchill when he was fighting Adolf Hitler. They tried to bomb the Foreign Office when we were at war with Adolf Hitler. They murdered a British minister, Lord Moyne. They murdered the United Nations envoy, Count Bernadotte. They murdered British soldiers, service people, policemen, civil servants. They invented terrorism. There's a reason, you know, of why the late Her Majesty the Queen never, ever, ever visited Israel. Although she went everywhere else in the world, she would never visit Israel. Why? Because British citizens, servicemen, policemen, civil servants, British government institutions were murdered and destroyed by terrorists from exactly the same political organization founded by Jabotinsky, calling themselves revisionists, fashioning themselves upon Mussolini's fascism. These people are running Israel today. That's why the Queen never went there. She refused to go there.
That was George Galloway on the Piers Morgan show, demonstrating, I should say, clearly that no one party, no one faction has the moral high ground, as we've put out there when we posted that clip on my profile. Contrary to behavior by all factions, the best takeaway from George Galloway's response to Piers Morgan about historic Israeli terrorism is no faction owns the moral high ground. Only genuine humility and sincere empathy suffice to ensure lasting peace. And that's what we believe has been lacking, because instead there's been propaganda aimed at railroading this conversation into that forced choice in the false dialectic that it's a choice between civilized Netanyahu and barbarian medieval terrorists. That dialectic that Piers Morgan himself has been guilty of propping up is a false dialectic. And there has always been the other choices available. But of course, the parties that want war are not suited. It doesn't suit them. They are not convenienced by those other choices available. We're going to conclude by showing a clip of US Colonel McGregor again and his recent reflections on some of the fallout from this. Before we do, just to recap for everybody, what this live stream is demonstrating is that the openly admitted to now Israeli government's position is the rejection of a two-state solution. Instead, it's a belief in having a one Israeli state dominating all lands currently occupied by the Palestinian people. Now, of course, what that leads to is an expansion of the occupation. Therefore, in a one-state context, keep in mind the precise arguments that were used by the Likudniks prior to this conflict, this current October the 7th, post-October the 7th conflict, as to why they were rejecting the notion of a one-state solution coming from peace activists. Remember, there was a strong faction of peace activists that were calling for, Osman, a one-state solution. If you remember that, there were loads of these pro-Palestinian even peace activists saying only one state is going to solve this problem. But at the time, in the last running up to October the 7th, when these calls were being made by peace activists, the Netanyahu-Wing Zionist response was a one-state solution means the end of Israel. And their response, the reason that was their response, is because they were arguing, if we include all these current Palestinians in the West Bank and all those Palestinians in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, to become one part of that one-state solution, it means the end of the Israeli majority. And that would mean the end of the Israeli Jewish majority. And that would mean the end of Israel as a Jewish state. So that was the Likud reason given up until this moment for rejecting a one-state solution. So pay attention to that argument, that the reason we reject the pro-Palestine peace protesters' demand of a one-state solution is because it will mean a Palestinian Arab majority inside Israel, and therefore the end of the Israeli Jewish majority, and therefore the end of Israel as a Jewish state. When Likud now come along and say they also want now a one-state solution, it must mean that the same argument applies, that this would imply the end of the Jewish majority inside Israel. But of course, we know that Likud would never tolerate that, because that's the very same Likud that brought in the citizenship law stating very clearly that Israel is a Jewish state, which is why people coming from abroad who are Jewish get given free Israeli citizenship, but those others who come from abroad who are not Jewish don't just get the right to Israeli citizenship. So far, so good. That's all part of the current policy. But if Likud, therefore, keeping that law in mind, is now saying we believe in a one-state solution, while also saying, as their law currently officially states, that Israel must remain a Jewish majority state, the implication that is unavoidable is that they will do through this war whatever they can to make sure Palestinian Arabs do not become a majority in the one state that they end up occupying. Now, the scary thing is, as we describe that, remember something. Last week in Warrior Creed, we revealed that Netanyahu's official policy, by quoting from the original Hebrew and its translation in The Intercept, we demonstrated to all our viewers that Netanyahu said he wants to thin out the population of Gaza. Now add all of that together. If Likud no longer believes in the two-state solution, but now wants a one-state solution, and therefore to expand their occupation, but they also state openly through their law that Israel is a Jewish state, which belongs to a Jewish majority, and they want that one state that will have a Jewish majority between the river and the sea, while also saying they're going to thin out the Palestinian population, join all those dots, and now understand the war that you're going to be supporting. It is very, very scary to hear all of this, because it means nothing other than ethnic cleansing, which we've said already on this show, what the only interpretation one could give to the notion of thinning out the population. The other thing that comes to mind when hearing all of this is that the notion of projection, that actually everything that is being alleged about the opposition is actually what those in power are doing. And they're throwing the allegations through projection to the other side so that those allegations don't stick on them. From the river to the sea, has that projection that, oh, that's a genocidal chant, has already been thrown to the other side, while it's the official policy of Likud. The notion of a one-state solution, no, that means the end of Israel. That allegation has already been thrown to the other side, so that when Netanyahu does it, they get to define what it means. They get to frame the conversation in their own way. The projection has been there by inversion from the very beginning in this propaganda. And it is indeed very scary, because it means the war we're supporting, the war that Netanyahu seems hell-bent on not ending, is a war for the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, at least in Gaza, if not the West Bank as well, which is why you're hearing the calls increase about why Jordan doesn't simply take them, Egypt doesn't take them, the idea that there is already a Palestinian state. It's called Jordan. No, actually, Jordan is the Hashemite Arab kingdom granted by the British to the Hashemite family, a very different entity to a Palestinian state. It's a creation of British foreign policy. So that's what you're hearing in the press. It's why the Israeli government is demanding that Egypt open the Rafah crossing, because they want to cleanse the land of Palestinians so that they can have their one-state solution. If they don't do that, they end up with a Palestinian majority inside a land occupied by the Israeli military. What that leads to, finally, to conclude, is the other projection that's already been thrown over there so that the accusation doesn't stick this way, and that is the idea of an apartheid state. But up until this point, it was a matter of debate that the Likudniks were responding by saying, we're not an apartheid state because 20% of Israel are Arab citizens who have political parties and the right to participate. That is true, by the way. 20% of Israel are Arab citizens. They have political parties, and they have judges, they have lawyers, and they have media personalities, they have musicians, they have a lot of all of these things from culture. But if you're saying now you want a one-state solution and you want to thin out the population of Gaza, and your law states that Israel is a Jewish state and therefore must maintain its Jewish character, what do you do if the Palestinian population become the majority? The only thing you can do is double down on the idea that Israel is strictly a Jewish state, which leads to an apartheid situation. There's no way out of that logic unless you thin the population, which is also ethnic cleansing. And that's why last week in this live stream, we demonstrated that even Secretary of State for Defense Lloyd Austin in the US stated that Israel may win this war tactically, but we'll lose it strategically. Because once you've adopted these sorts of policies we've demonstrated today, there's no way around it. Either you become an apartheid state by allowing a Palestinian majority from Gaza and the West Bank under an Israeli state that states by law that it's a Jewish state that must maintain its Jewish identity, and you continue asking for settlers from Brooklyn to come to the settlements in occupied lands, desperately attempting to maintain your majority. So either you become an apartheid state or you become a state that's actively engaged in ethnic cleansing. And that's why we suggest US Secretary of State Lloyd Austin, seeing the writing on the wall, said last week that Israel is losing this strategically. There's no way around this logic. And now with that, have a listen to US Colonel retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor about what the fallout would be. If Israel continues in this way, which Netanyahu will do, is doing, the fallout is incredibly dangerous. This is one potential outcome that US Colonel Macgregor, retired Colonel Macgregor, is stating could happen due to the conflict in the Middle East.
The United States has become a society in free fall. We don't even know who we are. We don't have an identity. We stand by and watch as the federal government and its armed supporters and the civil populace deface monuments and tear down monuments, destroy our heritage, our culture, our history. The Europeans watch this and they say, well, it looks like the Americans are finished. And at the same time, if you look at someone like Olaf Scholz, who is now wants to declare emergency conditions in Germany, on the grounds that Germany has to be ready to fight Russia, which is, of course, laughable. In reality, he's trying to prepare his regime to suppress opposition to it inside Germany. That is appalling, but that's where he's headed. I wouldn't be surprised if Mr. Macron doesn't end up in the same position. All of these governments in the West are going to be swept away. They're finished. They're done. Their populations have had it with them. They are going to be replaced. But they're not going to be replaced by the people or people like the individuals that are currently governing Western Europe or this country.
That's a retired US Army colonel stating all of the governments in the West are going to be swept away and replaced. It is an incredibly alarming statement to make. And there he is posting the written version of it on his feed. We'll read it. Douglas Macgregor, that's his official verified account. All of these governments in the West are going to be swept away. They're going to be replaced. France, Germany, and us. They're finished. They're done. Their populations have had it with them. Now, of course, it isn't just the war in Gaza that would cause such a potential outcome. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen, but such a potential outcome. But that would be a potential trigger for it. Because let's remember, as the BBC reported, and we've been highlighting for a while now on this live stream, there is a huge risk, the European governments are warning, of Christmas attacks. And we're stating that that's what the warmongers would want, a false flag, in order to allow them to bring in their tyranny and use that as a pretext, these attacks as a pretext to bring in more state control of their populations to thwart precisely what the retired Colonel Macgregor there was warning of. And that is that their populations, including in the US, across Europe, have had it with their governments that use war to launder money. I still maintain that there's hope. I'm optimistic. I think we can avoid World War III. And I think that Netanyahu's days are numbered. But of course, who listens to me. Osman, over to you.
What are the tools of rationalism that are being used by them and used even from our side, Maajid, to get the people to understand what we're talking about? What we're talking about here is we're talking about empathy. We're talking about a concept of humanism that has been taught to us through decades, through the sophistry in the media. Yeah. So the idea of every human life is worth something, because human beings love, and we're the higher creature in the animal kingdom, so to speak. But what happens with this is when we actually get down to the crux of it, what we get to a point where when COVID happened, we had the fourth industrial revolution. They used the fourth industrial revolution. They pushed the button. 67% of humanity goes behind closed doors. You get that experiment. You get the result of that experiment. You get to see, okay, if there's a pandemic, this is what happens. Now you've got a next part, in a sense, of that experiment with Ukraine and with Israel as well. With what's going on with the Palestinians, where it's pretty much an open genocide. Even individuals from the UN have looked at this and they've said, look, this is one conflict that's happened in front of everyone, where more journalists, more UN representatives have been killed just in this conflict in front of everyone than in any other conflict. Yep. So the flak jacket that we've seen for the last 2 decades, with press written in white tape on the flak jacket, which was supposed to protect the journalist, no longer protects the journalist. The UN lettering, which was supposed to make you immune to any violence in any region because you were neutral. Remember, when Srebrenica happened, our forces were there as a UN peacekeeping force, weren't they? They were there from that UN peacekeeping force perspective.
Specifically, to bolster this point here, it was the Dutch peacekeepers with the UN umbrella that watched as Srebrenica happened, because they didn't have the requisite orders to intervene, and therefore, as a fact of history, the UN peacekeepers watched as 3,000 Muslim men and boys were buried at Srebrenica.
Yeah. Now, that emphasizes the neutral aspect. Neutral to the point of not doing anything, but that used to protect the individual. If you had UN written on you, used to protect you. Now what we've got is in the fourth industrial revolution right now, where everyone gets to see everything. We also get to see, and I know we use this word a lot because we want people to learn it, the social dominance hierarchy. And what this social dominance hierarchy means is that even from a certain point of view, we will accept the facade that we're playing. Yeah, we'll all look round at each other naked in the room and say, I like your suit. Yeah, we'll all pretend to do that because we understand at a very intrinsic, and also as it's put across with what's going on an implicit level, because it's never made explicit. You can't make it explicit. On an implicit level, that if you want to belong, you have to accept what's being put across to you. And this is very interesting, because what's happening with Israel, and remember what's happened with Ukraine as well, and we reference that with what happened in Syria. Because what happened in Syria was that we said, okay, it was Assad's regime that was supported by Putin, that we had individuals from the UK go there to fight Assad's regime that were then arrested as foreign fighters, and ISIS was actually created through that whole system. Yeah. And then we saw the double standard when it came to Ukraine.
Foreign fighters being openly encouraged to go to the Ukraine, to join the Ukrainian armed forces that had the Nazi Azov battalion serving, formally incorporated into their armed forces as the National Guard. They even were dipping bullets into pig's lard on their own Twitter feed so that they could target the Russian Muslim forces. That was the Azov Brigade. That is indisputably Nazi. It is not a matter of dispute. They are a Nazi battalion, and that was okay. Those fighters that went over there were hailed by the corporatist press as freedom fighters.
Yeah, and what you get from that point of view is that we then look and we say, okay, are we being too harsh with this? Are we looking at this and seeing a double standard from the point of view of a concept of the acceptable citizen who is supposedly outwardly from representing this concept of Judeo-Christian? Yeah, but remember, we're not talking about Judeo-Christian here, because the reality of this is that any ideology, so we're talking about any subtle ideology that's put there, any idea of patriotism, any idea of skin tone, any idea of belonging that's put there is your religion. It's the group that it binds you to. Yeah. But what we get very comfortably with this is, since the global war on terror, we've had this constant building of a narrative whereby you have 1/5 of the world's population that has been following the ideology of a barbarian warlord from 1400 years ago, a group that spread out of Arabia and invaded the local regions by the sword, and any region that they're in is always described as occupied, as we joked about over the weekend when we talked about Spain, and we said that the Muslims were there for how long, Maajid?
900 years.
But yet they occupied it for 900 years.
It's no joke, is it? 900 years. I mean, imagine that. That's how long they were there for. You can see it in the architecture. You can see it in what are the remnants and the current Spanish culture, the language. The word mosque comes from the Spanish el mezquita. You know, we say masjid, the place of sajda, or the place to prostrate in. But the English rendition mosque comes from the Spanish el mezquita. The language, it's all there. 900 years.
You know what the mosquito word comes from, don't you? Mosquito, to suck the blood out.
Yeah.
And the other interesting point with this is that the same thing with India, 1300 years. Same thing with China, 1300 years. But we're talking about the Muslims that were there weren't Muslims. They were Chinese, or they were Indian. They were citizens. They were part and parcel of the environment around them, because you didn't have an atomized identity like that. The Muslim is it's a philosophical stance that actually connects you to your environment. It stops atomization. It's supposed to stop atomization. But we're not here to preach. This isn't about preaching. And if we were going to get into that problem, so we've got a whole discussion point from that perspective as well.
Let me make this clear, in case, because there have been some voices raising doubts since COVID. Let me make this 100% clear. the leader of Hizb ut-Tahrir that you all saw on your airwaves, invited on by Piers Morgan, while yours truly remains blocked by him for criticizing him for going to the Caribbean, to Antigua to be precise, during COVID lockdowns, while advocating that everybody else in the nation remain locked down. His response was to block me. Of course, LBC's response, owned by the parent company Global, was to cancel me. The point I'm making is he's invited the leader, current serving leader of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Britain, Dr. Abdul Wahid, onto his show. If our purpose was to preach, that man, Abdul Wahid, I know him very well, served on the leadership committee with him for a long time. That man, Dr. Abdul Wahid, is only leader of Hizb ut-Tahrir because when it was offered to me by the leader, Dr. Naseem Ghani, before him, and Dr. Naseem went on to become the founder of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Bangladesh, when Dr. Naseem offered me the leadership of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Britain, my response was to resign a week later, and told him I no longer believed in the ideology. If our purpose was to preach, if our purpose was to use all of this as an escape, as some form of fifth column agenda to convert everybody to some medieval notion of Islam, then the behavior has not really the kind of behavior that has shunned that role and has done more self-sabotage in that way, if it was to present ourselves as some form of religious takeover, has engaged in more self-sabotage against that purpose than almost any other publicly present Muslim in this country or present on the world. That is honestly not our purpose. We're not here to forcibly or surreptitiously or stealthily convert anyone. We're about humans, Usman.
And this is the point here, that when we're talking about the idea of humanism, thing is here, Maajid, that I don't know if you saw Bill Maher here recently. He did a
Bill Maher, yeah.
Is it Bill Maher? Am I pronouncing
Maher is the Arabic word, the name, which is
I've done what the boys do, where it's like, but they literally pronounced it as it's spelled.
Sheikh Bill Maher.
I've never heard his second name said. Yeah. Bill Maher.
Yeah.
So you see him do the rant where where the Muslim is presented from the ideology that he follows as being the savage. That the root of this it's not the Palestinians' fault that they're brought up within this insular group that are a bunch of savages. That you can't have a bunch of savages living next to you. It's like do not open up the EU borders. Do you remember when we were part of the EU? Why? Because the Romanians are going to come. We're going to get the UK will get invaded by gypsies from Romania. Think about this. It's a good analogy, because if I said to you, okay, you can live where you're living, but we're going to put a gypsy camp next to you. Say, no way. We can't have gypsies. Oh, but what we're also going to do is we're going to give the gypsies the same rights you've got to build whatever they want and do whatever. You're like, no, these people have got no idea of an aesthetic. You're going to get some mutilated thing next to my gentrified area. Do you see the analogy I'm getting? It's a very simple analogy of how people are viewed. And you have to step out and then look and understand what othering means. You have to remember, Maajid, that the work we've done beyond the side that I was sitting on, where I was having to literally go into the microcosm of that microcosm where the othering was happening, and go, okay, what is going on with this reciprocal radicalization? So from one side with Muslims, from the other side sitting down with EDL members, for example, and to sit there and realize that even though we can get quite deluded because we have this cosmopolitan circle around us, whereby there's a level of integration. But what we don't understand is that humanity and human beings as a biological organism, from a natural perspective, can't actually function beyond 150 individuals if we're talking about from a very natural perspective. Yeah, 150 individuals within a group, and within that group it used to be up to you could only have up to a certain amount of males and more females, because you wouldn't be able. So even from that point of view, there was a biological need for the common philosophical stance that would allow human beings to find common cause. And why do you think people are going out and raiding and doing all of this stuff? Because if we're looking at this functionality whereby the insular group works with 150 individuals, it's very interesting, isn't it? It's very interesting, Maajid, because what do we see? What do we see? Go to any inner city, go to any community, you're going to start, you start seeing where the 150 are getting together, whether it's the mosque, the synagogue, the church. But the great thing now that the system has figured out is this digital sphere. The digital sphere where you can be part of a group where it doesn't matter that you're not actually really part of anything. You might be talking to a bot, you might be talking to AI, but you feel like you're part of something. Now, what happens with this is, if we're talking about some deep moral imperative that is going to bring out the humanism in people, are we serious? Are you serious, bro? Are we serious? Because this is the question mark with this is, are people going to get up and recognize the humanity in someone else if they don't know that someone else, and the effort to know that other person? But also remember the system at the top, which you want to belong to. Yeah, you don't think there was a whole load of individuals in the US, a whole load of parents that were looking and going, do I really agree with this whole ambiguity around the semantics of gender? Because we use this word semantics at the beginning, and semantics are a very interesting. It's a very interesting point, because even the idea of Jew, and I hate using that word Jew like that, but I'm using it on purpose to throw it out. That the idea of Jew was the term itself was being thrown onto people who weren't following a theology. It was an identity. So externally, there was people who weren't following a theology, but they were part of a community or that identity. There was I am Jewish. And where were they oppressed? They were oppressed in Europe. And when you had the European Jewry go over to Palestine, and then you had the Arab states kick out their populace of Jews who had been there for thousands of years. Yep. What you get with this is, at the beginning of this, there was a possibility of a two-state solution. I mean, I've been going through Miko Peled's book. His father was a general that fought in the war, and he was part of the Israeli military as well. And he talks about the idealism. So there was an idealism that wasn't coming from a concept of invasion. It was coming from a concept of self-survival, coming from a concept of community. And then later on, what you get with this is people becoming humanized. So Mikael Peled talks about how his father was friends with Yasser Arafat and how they were looking towards this two-state solution. But then what you get later on is this, the hyper Zionism coming. But we shouldn't use the term, even Zionism itself is getting stuck. That's getting stuck with the term.
Correct.
Because what we're getting with this is we're getting moves that are really about geopolitics. Because what we're getting shown right now is are you going to go behind closed doors like the 67% when we push the button? Like what happened during COVID, Maajid. That was a successful experiment. 67% went behind closed doors for 2 years. Yeah. Now we're going to commit a genocide in front of you. Yeah, you can come out and protest. But what is really going to happen? And this is what General McGregor's on about. It's a very, very dangerous experiment. It's a very dangerous experiment because
Colonel McGregor.
Sorry?
Colonel
McGregor. Sorry. Colonel McGregor. So my apologies if the Colonel's watching.
I hope he is, man. He's been quite good on geopolitical stuff. You're always welcome on this show.
Always. It'd be very interesting to get his take on things. But the point being that it's a very dangerous experiment, isn't it? Because first things first is, when we're talking about attacks this Christmas, it's more than the perfect environment for attacks this Christmas. It's like we know that out there right now there's reactionary lunatics that are sitting there and through their own detachment and cognitive dissonance will be looking towards an act of zealotry. But also the other aspect of this is through being devalued and see, this is the other aspect, and being shown no dignity and worthlessness. Because the point is with this, Maajid, that part of this grand experiment is to say that the Muslim life isn't valued, because the double standard is put in front of you and say, okay, well, accept it. This is just the way it is. And yeah, you can go and we can use the term about the in terms of the field Muslim and the house Muslim, that doesn't even exist anymore. Because now you've got a level where the whole structure itself is saying, okay, no, this is just the way we're moving now. This is the way we're moving. You either take it or you leave it. And even in terms of what's going on in the Middle East right now, what we see with even the Middle Eastern states is that they're looking and they're going, look, guys, can't we just have peace? We've moved along where the world's in a different place right now. Yeah, this isn't, you can say whatever you want to say about Muslims, but yeah, when the World Cup happened and people were saying, well, we're not going to be able to go and drink up there. We're not going to be able to go and do this. And then people went there and they were like, I really enjoyed that. That was really nice. The people were really hospitable. I didn't really, I was able to relax out there. I didn't need to. Since
then, I've even seen social media clips of people talking about the benefits of Istinjat.
Yeah. of coming back in
using water to wash after visiting the loo. Even Ben Goldsmith was tweeting about that, Jemima's brother.
And you think he would have discovered that earlier? Do you see what I mean? So, but the point being with this, when we've got this thing going on whereby the holiday destination now for a lot of Westerners are the Muslim lands, or if you want to call them that, because what we've got now is we are in that global space. Saudi, Maajid, is where the big boxing shows, sports events. Yeah, I think the with the UFCs, with the boxing events, with the concerts, they're happening in the Middle East. So the argument and experiment that's being presented right now, it's actually think about this, Maajid. So think about it from our perspective of when we're analysing. Yeah, even in terms of thought process, in terms of public opinion, the experiment is very interesting, because if you were to look and see what power you've got left when you push that button, now's exactly the time. Because what you get to see with this is you get to see if there is a step forward into get rid of the facade and just say, like Palpatine did. You know, at first it's like, we need to defend the Republic. And then all of a sudden he comes out as the Emperor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the time when such hands will be revealed.
Yeah, and that's the thing. This is where that if there is no protest, if there is no balance with this, we could be we're moving into a different level of totalitarianism if we're looking at one side of the system. The other problem with this is does the other side of, even from a national theatre play perspective, does the other side sit there passively? Because we've seen with Russia, we've seen with China, we've seen with Turkey. Yeah, there's a block on one side that is now looking and saying, wait a minute, if we let you guys take this, don't you take more? Now this is, what was the excuse for fighting Hitler, Maajid? If we let you take that, how far out are you going to come?
Yeah.
And I fear we find ourselves on the wrong side of history, because there's no excuse for what is going on right now. And even if you want to look at it from the best that they've got within the system to be the propagandists for this, we saw Ben Shapiro get taken apart recently by a Jewish student who first came out and asked Ben about, did your family die in the Holocaust? And Ben explained about, there was distant members of his family, and obviously they knew people whose families had died in the Holocaust. And this student explained about how he had direct grandparents who had suffered, and talked about the trauma of the Jewish community. Then very cleverly used the concept that that the whole argument for Israel existing is because of and I use this term, cultural framing, which is the actual correct term for it, which talks about the cultural framing that the group has for its trauma. Yep. So like if you get an individual and the individual has been sexually abused, that sexual abuse frames that individual's relativity for how they're functioning within society. Makes sense, Maajid? Yep. So that the abuse they've suffered makes them, so if they're insecure, if they're vulnerable, you can trace it back to that abuse, yeah? So what we have with Israel and the argument for Zionism is there was the Holocaust, there was all of the pogroms before that. This is our relative experience, which is why we are reacting the way that we're reacting. We need to defend ourselves. Yep. Now, the student made that point and then brought it back to Shapiro's anti-woke arguments against BLM.
Yeah.
500 years of oppression, millions of, literally we're talking about, if the figures are correct, we're talking about at least 2 million people during the Atlantic slave trade. But then expand upon that. Who do you get to now? You get to the Palestinians and the cultural framing around that. And then what ends up happening is, as soon as you bring in the concept of cultural framing, the whole argument starts falling apart. Yeah, so you see Shapiro falling apart. And the problem with this is, it's like, all it takes is a level of critical thinking. But what we've got going on is the propagandists are very unfairly dehumanizing and very irresponsibly dehumanizing 1/5 of humanity with this label where you're literally saying that these people are savages. They are savages, whether they're in France, whether they're in Denmark. We're not talking about Palestinians. These Muslims are savages. They've been 1400 years ago, they came out, declared jihad, and have been raping and pillaging and killing. And if we let them get a foothold anywhere, they'll do that again.
In fact, this is a good opportunity to play the clip. This is the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, on this very topic of his view that Muslims are savages.
Islam, my friends, is indeed evil. Look at its so-called prophet Muhammad. He slaughtered Jewish tribes, he raped a young girl, he gave sex slaves as a gift to his henchmen, and he is still today an example for more than 1 billion Muslims worldwide. No wonder that some of his followers take to terrorism. Islam preaches hatred, propagates violence, and is barbaric and violent by nature. It wants all Muslims to submit. It is incompatible with freedom as we know it. And nothing will ever change that. That's why we should de-Islamize our societies in order to stay free nations. No appeasement, no concessions, but vigilance, perseverance, and strength against barbarism is the one thing we should do. And I hope with your support.
Now, Usman, before I throw back to you for the last words on this, because we're nearly up to the end of time, I think it's important to mention the idea of no appeasement that you just heard there by the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Geert Wilders. It's not a joke that a European leader of government is to speak in such words about a very significant and growing minority presence in Europe, and that is Muslims. It is incredibly inflammatory, and what it could lead to and is leading to and has led to is incredibly dangerous. But it's also factually inaccurate, just as a matter of fact. What he said there is simply ahistoric. It is religiously illiterate, and this is coming from, we have, of course, been consumed by this topic of Muslim-West relations for our entire lives, because our entire lives have been defined by that topic. We are the generation born into that very topic. And so understand something. This idea that wherever Muslims, as he said in his video, wherever Muslims have been, it's been barbaric and backward because Islam demands this domination. The very numbers that we count with in the Western education system are known as the Arabic numerals. The Arabic numerals are the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 0 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. Those numbers are the Arabic numerals that we in the Western world use and count with till this day, not the Roman numerals. Because it was an Arab scientist, Muslim Arab scientist, who first emphasized in his treatise the importance of the sifr, the 0, without which you couldn't have the decimal place and therefore couldn't multiply by 10. They used to multiply by 12, hence the Roman system. Hence the difference between weighing in kg and pounds and all of the inches and centimeters that we have still till this day in Britain, because Britain used to be occupied by the Romans. So understand something. When he states that Islam has never led to civilization, the very numbers that we used to calculate with are the Arabic numerals prior to the articulation of the concept of 0 by an Arab Muslim philosopher, sifr, which comes, the word Arabic for 0, sifr, it relates to the word cipher that we still use till today to indicate 0, cipher. Yeah, it's sifr. The concept, the philosophical concept of 0. It's hard to emphasize how important this is for our intellectual heritage and, as a result, our civilization. If we didn't have a concept of 0, we would not be able to multiply by 10 and divide by 10. The decimal, all of that would be gone, which means the foundations of our mathematics as we know them today would not exist. Go to Al-Khwarizmi, and his book, Al-Jabr Al-Khwarizmi, is where the word algebra comes from. The 900-year presence of Muslims in Spain is why the ancient Greek philosophies were preserved and reintroduced into Europe, because what has been termed, and we don't have to accept it as such, but still, what has been termed as the Dark Ages of Europe, where those philosophies were prohibited, were reintroduced into Europe due to the Arab presence in Spain. They were translated first into Arabic and then reintroduced into European languages via Arabic. So this kind of speech given by the PM-elect, now soon to be PM, I think, of the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, is ahistoric and ignorant. The idea that Islam leads to nothing but barbarism is refuted by the very foundations of Western intellectual culture. But obviously, for somebody to be aware of that would mean that they themselves aren't either ignorant or malicious. In the case of Wilders, as in the case of other such controlled actors in the public sphere, I would err on the side that they are malicious, because every opportunity has been provided to them to cease such inflammatory rhetoric, and they've chosen to continue to incite. This from the continent that witnessed, please pay attention to these words, and I say them very calmly, though we are very concerned. This is coming from a prime minister of a country that sits in the continent of which the last genocide they witnessed was against Muslims. And that was the Srebrenica genocide we referred to earlier in Bosnia with the Yugoslav wars. That's the context in which this sentence or this speech from Geert Wilders should be read, because the Rohingya genocide against Muslims in Myanmar, the Uyghur genocide against Muslims in China, all of this is the context in which, if you hear that speech and then you talk about radicalization and incitement to violence and incitement to demonization and the dehumanization of what is 10% of France at the moment, and a huge chunk of the German minority are Muslim, both Turks and obviously now Syrian, it is incredibly dangerous to speak in such terms in a continent where the last genocide was against the very minority community that Geert Wilders there is defaming and punching down upon and ridiculing.
Yeah.
Osman, any last reflections?
You have to remember, Maajid, that in our visits to Europe, I remember being in Germany, and I think I told you this story before about the cab driver. And the cab driver turned around and he goes, "Pray for us, brothers." He goes, "Oh, you brothers in Britain, you've got it. Yeah, it's good. You're very confident. But over here, where I think he was third generation German, but he said we're still seen as guest immigrants." And the same experience when I was in Belgium. I mean, the complaints about France were just on another level. And obviously with Holland, I know the community well over there from going and training in Holland, and with a lot of the Moroccan fighters over there, or the fighters of Moroccan descent that are Dutch. But the point being with this, that we're trying to humanize ourselves, and I keep saying this, Maajid. It's like, yeah, we haven't grown up in the insular community. We grew up outside, and
both of us,
yeah. And we've got the people next to us that recognize, but then what ends up happening with this is like you're pushing water uphill. Yeah, and I'm not talking about for myself. I'm talking about the fact that we've got communities now that are no longer even the insular communities that we were talking about in the 2000s. Yep. We're talking about communities now that we look at and we go, okay, this is, if anything, the complaint would be, it's a consumeristic hip hop mess. Do you see what I mean? If that was a complaint to be made, that you're not talking about communities that are separate, as has been shown with Palestine right now, where anyone that's watching this could have a conversation with one of those Palestinians in Gaza. And what would they be discussing? Yeah, I like to get a macchiato. No, I prefer this. You'll find that you've got, even in terms of lifestyle, 90% commonality. We're no longer in that world. But what we are being shown is this choice of, if you want to, taking on the facade. Yeah, literally taking on the facade. Yeah, the same way that you feel powerless against being able to argue that, well, actually, in order to get inflation down, why do you have to put the interest rates up? In fact, you're making us poorer, while trying to say that we've got too much income, but we haven't got too much income because they're making us struggle.
Money.
And instead, no one's coming out on the streets to protest against that. No one's coming out on the streets to protest against us buying our energy from France. Yeah, or people in Germany who, from being the strongest economy in Europe, they're now cutting down the forests that they've got up there so they can have wood for fuel because of what happened in Ukraine. Or wondering why it is that if America and Britain and Europe love the Jews, that the threat is hung over the head of our Jewish brethren of, there's going to be another Holocaust. And we're not talking about the Middle East, are we? Because that threat is held over the heads of our Jewish brethren from the perspective of, well, Europe might turn against you at any moment. And a conversation, something that we're looking at or that we have been tackling. It isn't just, when it comes to humanism, our whole mission has been about human. And that idea, the argument that if you've got 90% commonality, or more than that, in fact, I'd say like 99% commonality, then that divide and conquer that's being used against you is being used against you because it's coercive persuasion. But the point is with this, Maajid, now we get back to that point. What are you going to do in this grand experiment? Because this is the grand experiment now. There's a genocide happening right in front of you. There's 1/5 of the population is being dehumanized right in front of you. Yeah. So remember Elon Musk with his tweets. The point is here, Maajid, remember, you know me, I don't do any of the we don't do it. I'm not going to Master can have some more porridge. The whole point with the stuff that happened at the Home Office was what? Because your methodology is completely different to the sellout, the Uncle Tom sellouts that were trying to do the rest. They were doing the prevent work and the intervention work. We're the only ones that were coming in and go, okay, here we represent Sheikh Ali, and you know our Sheikh Maajid, the historical legitimacy that's about love. Does he give us an excuse to hate?
No.
Does he? What ends up happening if we want to say us and them? There's no them.
I mean, that's though again, just to we should probably end on this point, but just to demonstrate that is evident in our behavior. If you look to policy positions of people, you want to know where they stand. Look to how they act. Those who want war, those who need war to continue, their very survival depends on it. By their actions, you should judge them. By their deeds, you should know them. You look to our positions, what we're calling for, peace, what we're arguing for, an end of the war, what we're saying that should be based on, a humanization for all, right? So, then you can see that they're the teachings very early on from the beginning of this current flare-up in Gaza. We pointed to the Abraham Accords and said there is a road for peace, but they will go for war. And everything we've said since then has been vindicated. You've seen how people are choosing war as opposed to peace. Because, of course, if you want to occupy, you need to eliminate all options for peace and eliminate the impression that there are indeed partners for peace and voices calling for peace. Hence, these very voices being cancelled and shadow banned and silenced on corporate media platforms, while other voices can be promoted, so that people are left with the impression that there is no voice for peace on any side of this, and therefore war is the only option. On that note, we're going to call it for today. This has been the Warrior Creed live stream. We'll be back next Tuesday. What is that date? Because I'm going to check it's not Christmas or something. What is next Tuesday? So today's the 19th is why I'm asking. So yeah, it will be the 26th. That's good.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good, because that will be in time for, I think that's
Boxing Day. Yeah, Boxing Day. Isn't it?
Yeah. So should we?
That's a good one. Yeah, it's a good one.
We'll have a Boxing Day live stream, folks. Boxing Day special on the 26th, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 3 p.m. UK. For those of you who want the podcast version of this course, that's available on Radical Media. The written up version of this is free for everybody to read via maajidnawaz.substack.com. The podcast file is a premium service for those who are premium subscribers. And of course, the live stream remains free on Rumble. We'll see you next week, 3 p.m. UK time, 10 a.m. EST for Rumble. This has been the Radical Maajid Nawaz, and my brother, as always, the infamous Usman Raja.
I'm about to witness the strength of street knowledge. Witness the strength. Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Terrorize the jam like troops in Pakistan.
Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Quick service announcement brought to you in part by Warriors.